In the winter of 1887, an ethnographer named James Mooney arrived in the Cherokee Nation in western North Carolina, having already spent 3 years corresponding with the Bureau of American Ethnology in Washington about what he believed was the most urgent documentary project in American anthropology. He was 31 years old, self-taught, the son of Irish immigrants, and he had no university degree. What he had was a conviction, stated plainly in his first letter to the Bureau's director, John Wesley Powell, that the ceremonial and cosmological knowledge of the eastern band of Cherokee was being lost at a rate that the academic establishment had not yet recognized, and that the window for recording it was closing faster than anyone in Washington understood. Powell hired him. He spent the next decade in the field. What he brought back changed everything. And then the Bureau decided what to do with it. I came to this through Mooney's own correspondence, which is where I come to most things that turn out to matter. The Mooney papers at the National Anthropological Archives in Suitland, Maryland, are one of the most substantial collections of 19th century ethnographic material in the country. Thousands of pages of field notes, interview transcripts, correspondence, and draft manuscripts covering Cherokee ceremonial life, oral tradition, and cosmological knowledge, in a depth that no researcher before or since has come close to matching. Most of what Mooney collected has been published, or summarized, or incorporated into the academic literature on Cherokee culture. But I was not looking at what had been published. I was looking at what had been held back, and at why, and at what the holding back cost. By the time this reaches you, you will have some familiarity with James Mooney's published work. Myths of the Cherokee, published in 1900 by the Bureau of American Ethnology, is still in print. Sacred Formulas of the Cherokees, published in 1891, is cited in virtually every serious study of Cherokee ceremonial practice. These are genuine contributions, carefully done, and I want to be clear that I am not here to diminish them. But the published works represent a selection. They represent what the Bureau of American Ethnology, under Powell and then under his successor William Henry Holmes, decided the reading public and the academic community would receive. And the selection was not made purely on the basis of scholarly merit. Because what Mooney collected in the field, particularly in his extended work with a Cherokee knowledge keeper named Swimmer, an older man, a practitioner of traditional medicine and ceremony, who had been one of the last trained in the full ceremonial curriculum before the disruptions of the removal era, went considerably further than what the published volumes contain. Swimmer was not an easy interview. Mooney's field notes from the first months are full of descriptions of failed approaches, of Swimmer declining to discuss certain subjects, of Mooney having to earn the relationship slowly through presence and demonstrated respect, rather than through the kind of directed questioning that Bureau field methods typically called for. He spent months in Swimmer's company before the conversations began to go where they ultimately went. He learned enough Cherokee to reduce his dependence on translators for sensitive material. He attended ceremonies. He made himself, over the course of more than a year, into someone Swimmer had reasons to trust, rather than to deflect. That investment matters for how you read what followed. Swimmer was not giving Mooney folklore. He was giving him operational knowledge. The distinction matters, and Mooney understood it, and he said so explicitly in his field notes. Folklore is a story about what a culture believes. Operational knowledge is the knowledge a practitioner needs in order to do something, to perform a ceremony correctly, to understand why a ceremony works, to understand what framework of reality the ceremony assumes and operates within. Swimmer was trained in that second category. He had been trained, in the years before removal had disrupted the transmission, in what the Cherokee ceremonial system called the full curriculum, the complete body of knowledge that a practitioner needed in order to serve the community's relationship with the cycles of the world. By the time Mooney found him, Swimmer was elderly. Some of his teachers were dead, and some of what he had been given had no one left to confirm it against. He was, in his own description as Mooney rendered it, a partial vessel for something that had once been held more completely. And he chose to give what he had to this particular outsider, for reasons that Mooney acknowledged he did not fully understand, because Mooney was honest enough to acknowledge the things he did not understand. What Swimmer told Mooney about the Cherokee understanding of time, of cycles, of the relationship between human action and larger cosmological patterns was not, in Mooney's own assessment, mythology in the Western sense of the word. Mooney wrote, in a field note from the winter of 1888, that he had spent 3 days with Swimmer discussing what he translated as the doctrine of recurrence. The Cherokee understanding that large-scale patterns in the world repeat across spans of time that human memory cannot individually contain, but that traditional knowledge systems are specifically designed to track across generations. He wrote that Swimmer had described these patterns not as prophecy in the sense of supernatural foreknowledge, but as something closer to what a naturalist would call a life cycle, a pattern observable in the past, therefore predictable in the future. Not because the future is fixed, but because the pattern is stable. Mooney found this framework philosophically coherent. He said so. He also noted that several specific patterns Swimmer described when checked against the Cherokee historical record he had been assembling appeared to track actual historical events with an accuracy that he could not account for by coincidence alone. He could not account for it by coincidence alone. That is the phrase in the field notes of a meticulous, skeptical, professionally trained observer. This is the part I keep returning to, because Mooney was not a romantic. His published work is notable precisely for its refusal of sentimentality. He documented what he found. He was honest about his uncertainties, and he was scrupulous about distinguishing between what his sources said and what he himself believed. His private correspondence, however, is less guarded, and in the letters he sent to Powell from the field in 1888 and 1889, he was more explicit about what he was hearing from Swimmer and about what he thought it meant. There is a letter dated February of 1889 in the Mooney papers at Suitland, in which he wrote to Powell that the Cherokee temporal knowledge Swimmer was transmitting to him was of a character that he found difficult to categorize using the existing frameworks of the discipline, and that he believed it deserved extended treatment in the Bureau's publications rather than the compressed summary he had been planning. He asked for more time. He asked for more resources. He asked for a commitment that the full scope of what Swimmer had given him would find its way into the published record. Powell's response, which is also in the collection, arrived 6 weeks later. It is 2 paragraphs. The first paragraph acknowledges Mooney's request. The second paragraph advises that the Bureau's publication priorities for the coming cycle had been set, that the ceremonial material Mooney had collected would appear in a summary form appropriate to the Bureau's general readership, and that material of a more speculative or interpretive character should be held in the research files rather than submitted for publication. Material of a more speculative or interpretive character. That is what Powell called the Cherokee doctrine of recurrence, the framework Swimmer had spent months transmitting to Mooney, the knowledge that Mooney had described as philosophically coherent and historically corroborated. Speculative. Hold it in the files. Consider what was actually in those files. The Mooney papers include a manuscript, never published, running to approximately 90 pages in draft form, titled in Mooney's hand, Cherokee Temporal Doctrine and the Cyclical Framework of World Events, a preliminary analysis. The manuscript is dated 1891, the same year Sacred Formulas of the Cherokees was published. It sits in the collection in a folder marked Research Drafts, not submitted. 90 pages. Sitting in a folder for 130 years. I read it over 2 days in the reading room at Suitland. I was, as far as the archivists could determine from the request records, the first researcher to request that specific folder in more than 40 years. What the manuscript contains is Mooney's attempt to render Swimmer's temporal framework in terms that a Western-educated reader could follow. He is careful, and he is honest about the limits of his translation, and he is explicit that he is working across a conceptual gap that he cannot fully bridge. But the outline of what Swimmer gave him is visible. The Cherokee temporal framework Mooney describes is not a calendar in the Western sense. It does not divide time into equal units moving linearly from past to future. It is a system of nested cycles, cycles within cycles, some spanning a human lifetime, some spanning many generations, some spanning what Swimmer described as the whole long story of the world. Each cycle has characteristic phases, periods of growth, periods of consolidation, periods of disruption, periods of dissolution and renewal. And the purpose of the knowledge system that Swimmer represented, the purpose of the ceremonial curriculum he had been trained in, was to track where a community stood within those cycles and to understand what each phase called for in terms of human action and human restraint. Mooney gives examples in the manuscript, drawn from Cherokee historical memory, of how the framework had been applied. He describes how ceremonial practitioners in previous generations had read the phase indicators, specific patterns in natural events, in community social dynamics, in the behavior of animals and the character of seasons, and had used that reading to advise on collective decisions, not predicting specific events, but characterizing the period, whether the current time was one that called for consolidation or expansion, for engagement or withdrawal, for holding what had been built, or for expecting disruption and preparing accordingly. Mooney found, in the historical accounts he had assembled, what he described as a rough but not negligible correspondence between the phase characterizations preserved in oral tradition and the actual character of the periods they described. Not perfect correspondence, not the kind of precision that would satisfy a statistical standard, but enough to make him take the framework seriously as a system of observation rather than dismissing it as a system of belief. And then he notes something that he returns to twice in the manuscript without resolving it. He notes that Swimmer's characterization of the period they were living through, the 1880s, the decade of their conversations, was, in Swimmer's framework, a period of apparent stability that was in fact a late phase of consolidation before a major disruption. Swimmer did not name what the disruption would be or when it would arrive. He described the phase indicators that told him where they were in the cycle, and he described what those indicators had historically preceded. He was not making a prediction. He was reading a position. And Mooney, writing in 1891, in the folder that no one read for 40 years, noted that some of what Swimmer had characterized as typical of the phase indicators for an impending disruption period had, in the years since their conversations, begun to appear in the public record with a frequency he found, in his words, worth noting without overinterpreting. Worth noting without overinterpreting. Mooney, to the end, would not be pushed further than the evidence would take him. This is not prophecy in the popular sense. Mooney is explicit about that, and it is one of the reasons the manuscript is more interesting than most of what circulates under the heading of Cherokee predictions. Swimmer was not claiming to know specific future events. He was claiming something subtler, and in a way more demanding, that the patterns are visible to those who have been trained to see them. That the training takes years and requires the transmission of a specific body of accumulated observational knowledge, and that the knowledge had been seriously disrupted by the removal era and its aftermath. What Swimmer was transmitting to Mooney was not the complete system. He was explicit about that too. It was what he had, from what he had been given, from what had survived. The question Powell's letter raises, The question I have not been able to answer is whether the decision to file the manuscript rather than publish it was a scholarly judgment or something else. Powell was not a man who avoided controversy for its own sake. The Bureau published material that was contested, that was disputed, that challenged conventional narratives. The Sacred Formulas volume itself generated significant resistance from readers who felt it disclosed ceremonial knowledge that should have remained private. So the explanation that Powell simply found the Temporal Doctrine manuscript too speculative for publication is not fully satisfying. Speculative is not the same as controversial, and the Bureau was not afraid of controversial. I want to be fair to Powell, because there are innocent readings of his response. Bureau directors in this period were managing enormous publication backlogs, limited budgets, and audiences that ranged from professional scholars to members of Congress who controlled funding and had strong opinions about what federal scientific institutions should be producing. The decision to publish some things and hold others could have been made on grounds that had nothing to do with the content of what was being held. I want to acknowledge that. But I cannot make the innocent reading fully work because of what came next. Mooney continued to work with the Bureau for years after Powell's letter. He published 2 more major volumes. He submitted other manuscripts, and none of them, not one, returned to the subject of Cherokee temporal doctrine or the cyclical framework he had written about in the 90-page manuscript. He did not try again. He did not resubmit. He did not publish the material independently, which he could have done, which other scholars of the period did when they felt institutional channels were closing to them. He simply stopped pursuing it. And in a letter to a colleague at the Smithsonian in 1904, a letter easy to miss because the relevant passage comes at the end of a paragraph about an entirely different subject, he wrote that he believed the most significant material he had collected in his career had not found its way into print, and that he doubted it would in his lifetime. The most significant material he had collected. Not in print. He doubted it would be. What the Bureau was careful about in this period was anything that could be read as validating indigenous knowledge frameworks as sophisticated analytical systems rather than as artifacts of a passing stage in human cultural development. That framing, the evolutionary framework that placed indigenous knowledge below Western scientific knowledge on a developmental scale, was not just a background assumption in 1890s anthropology. It was the explicit theoretical commitment of the Bureau of American Ethnology under Powell. It was the framework that justified the Bureau's existence and its funding. And a 90-page manuscript arguing that the Cherokee temporal doctrine was a philosophically coherent and historically corroborated system for tracking large-scale patterns in human affairs was not compatible with that framework. Not because the manuscript was wrong, but because if it was right, the framework was wrong. Swimmer died in 1899. Mooney died in 1921. The manuscript stayed in the folder. And the knowledge that Swimmer had spent months transmitting. Knowledge he had described as only a portion of what had once existed. Knowledge that he had given to the only outside observer he apparently trusted enough to receive it. That knowledge is now inaccessible in the form Swimmer held it. What Mooney wrote down is there, in 90 draft pages in a folder that almost no one has read. What Swimmer knew that Mooney could not fully translate, what lived in the ceremonial practice rather than in the verbal account of it, what required the full training that the removal era had disrupted and that no folder in Maryland can restore, that is gone in a way that 90 pages cannot recover. The Eastern Band of Cherokee community at Qualla Boundary in North Carolina has maintained its own knowledge preservation efforts through the 20th century and into the present. And those efforts have produced scholarship and cultural documentation that falls outside the scope of what I have been tracing here. Cherokee scholars have written about temporal doctrine and cyclical knowledge in their own terms, for their own purposes, through their own institutions. I want to name that clearly, because the story I have been telling is not the complete story of Cherokee temporal knowledge. It is the story of what a specific federal institution did with a specific body of knowledge at a specific moment. What it collected, what it decided to suppress, and what it left in a folder in Suitland, Maryland since 1891, waiting for someone to ask for it. The folder has a label. The label says research drafts not submitted. The knowledge is in there, imperfect and translated and partial, because one man spent years earning the right to ask, and one man was willing to give what he had, and then the institution that sent the first man to collect it decided that what he brought back did not fit the story it was telling about the world. If you think that matters, share it with someone who is willing to read 90 pages in a folder. That is all.